In part three of bones and bone structure, we'll take a detailed look at compact bone and spongy bone as far as their anatomy. And then we'll take a more detailed look at the periosteum and endosteum. These are all mentioned in the previous lessons. So let's take a look at the structure of the compact bone first. It's important to know that the osteon is the functional unit of compact bone. We only see osteons in compact bone. What the osteon consists of are these rings of concentric lamellae. These are layers of the bone matrix which actually form these rings around a central canal. So I'm going to take you to a picture from the Martini book. What we're looking at is a piece of bone. Over here would be the medullary cavity. And if you remember from our first lesson, we said the medullary cavity was lined by spongy bone. Then the rest of the bone, all in here, is compact bone, and then the very outer lining, like right here, is the periosteum. Right, so we're kind of just looking at a cross section of bone from the medullary cavity all the way out to the periosteum. So everything in here, guys, this is all compact bone. So each one of these structures here, this whole round structure here, this is an osteon. This is another osteon over here. All right, here's an osteon that's been cut. You can see the osteons run the length of the bone. So the concentric lamellae, the first structure I'm talking about, are these rings right here. Here's one. Here's a ring right there, right there. Here's another ring right there. So each one of these rings, this osteon happens to have one, two, three rings. Those are known as the concentric lamellae. Now they form a ring, which I had in the notes, around this little canal in the middle here. This is called the central canal, and you can see there's an artery and a vein in there, right? Probably an arteriole or a venule. These are small, these are microscopic. So the concentric lamellae, again, are these layers of bone matrix. They're rings that surround the central canal. Between the concentric lamellae, we have the lacuna. Those are the little cavities, the little pockets. Their job is to house the osteocyte. And if you remember from part two of this lesson, the osteocyte is the mature bone cell which maintains the bone matrix. So let's go to the picture for a minute. Right here, this little cavity right here would be the lacunae. Notice it's between this lamella and that lamella right there. And there's a lacuna. Here's another lacuna. Here's another lacuna. And living in those lacuna are the osteocytes. Now, the osteocytes can communicate with one another through small little canals. We mentioned this in the previous lesson also, known as the canaliculi. It's a little bit hard to see here, but let's go to this one. Actually, it's a little bit better. So let's just say there's an osteocyte living in here and an osteocyte living in here. If you see these small little lines going back and forth, like almost looks like cracks. Those little lines are tiny canals that allow for communication. You could see them here really well, what they did when they cut into the osteon. Let's just say let's just say this osteocyte here is going to communicate with this osteocyte. These cross lines here, the little cracks they look like, those are the canaliculi. Right, those are the canaliculi. And then the last structure, again, in the middle, was the central canal. Sometimes you hear the term haversian canal. But those are the structures that I'd like you to know that make up the osteon. Again, concentric lamellae, the rings, lacuna, or the cavities, or the chambers, or the pockets, they house the osteocyte. The osteocytes can speak to one another by these little cracks right here. They almost look like cracks, but they're little canals, so that communication can be made between osteocytes. And then all of this surrounds a central canal right over here. And again, the osteon runs straight up and down. All of these osteons are running straight up and down in the compact bone. And here we actually see a good picture of the central canal dissected, where we have a venule here and an arteriole here. What we'll look at next is how does the blood supply get into the bone. We'll look at these canals next. Let's just go to the note. So a couple other structures of compact bone in addition to the osteon are going to be the perforating canals, and then we'll take a look at two other types of lamellae. So these canals right over here and this one over here that are bringing the blood towards it from the periphery towards the center of the bone this way, and then that gives rise to the blood vessels that are in the central canal. These are known as the perforating canal, right? They have it labeled down over here. So that's the perforating canal. That's bringing the blood from the periphery towards the center of the medullary cavity. Let me just make sure we covered everything in the notes, right? So the perforating canals, they're perpendicular, right? They run into the bone. And again, like I said, they carry the blood vessels deep into the bone. They're bringing the blood into the bone and ultimately into where the bone marrow is going to be. The other lamellae that I like you to know are not part of the osteon. Take a look at these rings out over here. This is a ring right here of matrix. Here's another one. Right here, a lamella is like a thin plate, or you can think of it as a ring. But one, two, three, looks like four of them over here. These actually go around the circumference of the bone, so they're kind of wrapping around the bone. They're wrapping all the osteons. So that's why they call them circumferential lamellae. We're going to see in a lesson or two that as we add more of these rings to the outside of the bone is going to grow in width, right? As we grow up, when we're in our formative years, bones don't just grow in length, they need to grow in width. So we would add circumferential lamellae to the bone to make it wider. The other type of lamellae are these. There are lamellae between the osteons. These were probably part of an osteon at one time. Right? They're over here too. But during remodeling, our bones change all the time based on our activity. So the bones are constantly remodeling. They're not stagnant. Um, Lamellae may get tossed out of an osteon and just become like a remnant. They're in between. So these we're going to call interstitial lamellae. They may become part of an osteon again as the bone remodels. Whenever you hear the word interstitial, think in between. They're in between something. So let's go back to the note to make sure we covered everything. Let's take a look again at the circumferential lamellae. These are the lamellae that wrap around the long bone, right? They basically bind all the osteons together, and they're basically involved with bone growth. If you just want to add, I probably should have put it here, bone growth in width, right? By making a bone wider. Involved in bone growth in width. So you're always going to find them wrapping around the bone. Then finally, the interstitial lamellae, were remnants of osteons, right? They one time were part of an osteon, but because of remodeling, they got tossed out, and they fill in the spaces between the osteons. Okay, very good picture. Here's an actual micrograph. You can see they're actually pretty big. You don't really need to magnify them that much, but you can see these rings right here. All of these rings would be the concentric lamellae. You can see the lacuna, that's where the osteocytes would live. You can see the central canal. Here's a lamellae between this osteocyte, I'm sorry, between this osteon and this osteon and this osteon. So this is probably an interstitial lamellae. Let's compare now the compact bone to spongy bone. If you notice here, and I even put a little an exclamation point, spongy bone does not have osteons. Right? Does not have osteons. Instead, what makes up spongy bone, to give it that kind of porous look, are these little bony struts called trabeculae. So if you take a look over here, and we have the femur bone, we've looked at this picture before. This is a frontal section where they take a piece of the spongy bone and they magnify it so we can see it. So all of these struts of bone here, all of these struts, these are the trabeculae. Now, if we slice a trabeculae in half and look at it, we're going to see we have lamellae. We're going to have rings, just like we had in the osteon. But notice what's missing in the middle. There are no blood vessels. So that's why it's not an osteon. So the reason we really don't need any blood vessels in these trabeculae is this. These spaces here are filled with bone marrow. It's a bloody tissue. So we really don't need blood vessels within the bone because we have the blood around the bone, and nutrients and oxygen and waste products are going to diffuse through these little openings right over here, that bring the material in and out of the bone this way. Right? These are actually the openings of the canaliculi. So all of the space around the trabeculae is actually where the bone marrow is. Right? So all of this here, the bone around it would be filled with blood, right? So it's a very bloody type of tissue. So we don't need to have any blood vessels in the middle over here. And that's why it's not an osteon. Okay, so spongy bone, the lax osteons, again, know that the little struts of bone that form the spongy bone are called trabeculae. And we just said this a second ago, the spaces that surround the trabeculae are filled with red bone marrow. What's the function of bone marrow? It's basically forming all of our blood cells, right? Red blood cells, which are known as erythrocytes, white blood cells known as leukocytes, and then our platelets. There are some bones that do have some yellow bone marrow that store fat, right? So yellow bone marrow, just know, is not going to make blood cells. That's because it has fat. Okay, so now that we know the true anatomy of the compact bone, right, having the osteons, and then the spongy bone having the trabeculae, let's review, maybe in a little bit more detail, the periosteum and the endosteum. We've mentioned them in previous lessons. I just want to get into them in a little bit more detail. The periosteum is the membrane that covers the outside of the bone. And again, I think I said this before, peri means like a perimeter around. Osteum is the bone. It covers all parts of the bone except for the bone that's within the joint. And if we were to dissect it, we would see that there is an outer fibrous layer and an inner cellular layer. So what they did here is they take the periosteum, all of this is the periosteum, and they peel it away from the bone. You can see here's the circumferential lamellae. If you remember, the circumferential lamellae are on the outside of the bone here. So they peeled it away. This kind of grayish tissue right out over here, this is the fibrous layer. Right? If you can follow it all the way down over here, if you follow my cursor. And then the inner lining right here, you can see they actually put some cells there. This is the cellular layer. This is where those osteogenic cells are. Osteoblast cells are out over there, things we had talked about in the previous lesson. So those are the two layers. Now, that periosteum will actually, even this outer layer of the periosteum, will attach to the tendons of muscles that are coming to bones. We'll talk about this when we get to the muscle tissue chapter, that our tendons will come in and attach to the bone. They're actually going to attach at the periosteum or onto the periosteum. What keeps the periosteum firmly adherent or attached to the bone are these fibers known as perforating fibers. Let's go back to the picture for a minute. If you take a look over here, where's a good one? Here's a good one right here. Coming in from the fibrous layer, there's this fiber here. This fiber would go and actually get anchored into the bone and go down like this. And now it's going to be kind of cemented onto the bone. And that keeps this membrane, this periosteum, on the bone. Otherwise, it would be like if you were wearing a loose sock. If you ever put on like a sock that's been kind of stretched out or whatever, it would fall down your ankle. Well, that doesn't happen here because these perforating fibers go in, and we follow this one here, anchor into the bone. Here's another one up over here that came from this guy over here. So here's one that's actually not separated. So that perforating fiber right there, that holds the periosteum onto the bone. So the functions of the periosteum are pretty easy. They isolate the bone from surrounding structures, right? We have muscles that are um, on top of bones, so it's a way of keeping the muscles separate from the bone. The periosteum is very vascular and it has nerves. So this is the way blood vessels and nerves travel along the bone. We'll get into that in the next lesson. And they participate in bone growth and repair. So during our formative years, the periosteum is active, and when we're an adult, if we injure a bone, the periosteum is active, especially the cellular layer, in repair. All right, that's a good picture. Finally, the endosteum. So endo right here means within, right? So this is going to be the lining within the bone. This is an incomplete cellular layer. I'll show you what I mean by that, that we find lining the medullary cavity. Um, it's also found in the central canals and the perforating canals also. If you want to just add that in there. I probably should have put it there. I don't know why I didn't, but it lines the medullary cavity. If you just want to add, guys, also the central canal and perforating canal. It lines all those canals. I'll show you on a picture. Actually, if we go back to this one here, all of this red lining on the trabeculae of the spongy bone is going to be endosteum. Then the endosteum would line also the perforating canal, and it would line the central canal like that also. So all these internal canals. Here you could actually see, here's the central canal, and here's the endosteum right there. That inner lining right there. Okay, so I hope everybody wrote that down. Medullary cavity and the central canal and perforating canal. So the endosteum has osteoclasts, it has osteogenic cells. If you remember, the osteogenic cells give rise to osteoblasts, right? We would probably find them there also. Well, here I have it. It lines the central canals also. So here's a picture of the linings. What they did is they took the medullary cavity, and you can see here's the endosteum cells. Here's the endosteum cells again, but notice here's a big osteoclast. Remember, this was the cell that breaks down bone when we need to have bone broken down. Here's an osteogenic cell, which is the stem cell that produces osteoblasts. Here they're actually showing some osteoblasts. And here's the osteoid, that uncalcified matrix. So it's kind of not a continuous layer. That's why we say it's not continuous, because it has these other cells that are there also. All right, so that's the endosteum.